Hello dear viewers of my channel, this is a new part of the manhwa about the prince. Before starting the video, I wanted to thank all the sponsors of the channel and the guys who write comments, and also wanted to say that the next video on this manhwa will be a full release of this story. And also I'm preparing for you some surprise, namely another full issue of incredibly interesting manhwa. In general, I wish you all a pleasant viewing. The carriage was moving on the ground. A man started to get out of it. The fat man, as soon as he stepped into the camp, began to shout that this place is too unkempt. The camp continued its routine. The protagonist complained that the carriage was many times worse than his, to the amazement of his allies at how the prince had transformed for the task. The protagonist immediately started yelling at the doctor, who accidentally called him prince. The prince reminded the doctor that he should call him Reborn. A few days ago, back in the palace of the protagonist, the princess announced that she had finished packing her things, while the prince in a new guise burst into the room, saying that it was time for them to leave. The girl was immediately wary, and so were her servants, for they did not recognize the protagonist. The prince said that it was him, and she should not worry about his appearance. The girl immediately turned to her knights, and then with contempt in her eyes ordered the knights to arrest the stranger who was trying to pass himself off as the crown prince. The protagonist began shouting that he had healed the girl by taking 500 of her blows. Also, the protagonist yelled about giving delicious candy after the disgusting medicine. The girl was amazed. Now she started to believe that this man was a prince. The doctor said that it is so, and although the appearance has changed, it is their prince. And then the doctor confessed that it is indeed hard to see the prince in the new appearance. The girl didn't understand how the main character got to such a state, while the prince himself confessed that he got the camouflage from his father. Some time ago, the prince turned to the emperor and reported to his father that a civil war had broken out in a neighboring kingdom. The emperor immediately asked if it was true. He asked what exactly the prince wanted from him, and he told him that he wanted to go to them and get a job as a military doctor undercover. The protagonist said that in this way he would be able to evaluate the military strategy and many other aspects of another state. Suddenly, the emperor's nose twitched, which meant that he was proud of his son, while the prince asked if the emperor would allow him to do what he wanted to do. The protagonist said that right after talking to his father, he asked the court mage to cast a cloaking spell. The protagonist also confessed that the stomach is only an illusion, which will be removed after the physical impact. The girl was amazed at how believable the protagonist's identity card looked. The subordinates were worried about the clinic, but Damien said that they had left Denise, who diagnosed the patient's condition perfectly, and the doctor confessed that their clinic would last at least a month in the absence of the protagonist. They talked about what they would tell the public about the prince's recuperation due to his health. The doctor said he was worried about the prince having to be at the front, while Damien suggested that Anise was getting extra money because of the situation. The doctor thought that running to a place where patients needed treatment was natural for a doctor. Damien looked out the window and smiled, looking forward to the money. They continued their journey, and day and night changed each other. The girl appealed to her father, the king, after which the protagonist with her support was sent to the rear troops. Also, the protagonist, bidding farewell to the princess, handed her the recipe for the decoction she was to take. The protagonist, accompanied by about 10 soldiers of the royal guard, arrived at the rear of the front. The protagonist thought that the camp looked terrible and assumed that there were no healers in the place. Suddenly the prince noticed something interesting. Then he went into one of the tents. His face instantly filled with horror after what he saw in front of him. It turned out that the bodies of a huge number of people had been dumped in the tent. The prince immediately inquired who the man standing next to him was, and he was the caretaker of this camp. The protagonist stood silently for a while, and then with a serious expression said that he was a doctor. The man said that he had not heard that a doctor was coming. The prince immediately inquired about the picture that was unfolding inside the tent, while the military man with a completely calm look assumed that everyone inside was already dead. The man suddenly stated that some of the people inside were even moving. The man complained, because at this rate, the tent would simply not have enough room for the wounded soldiers. The prince didn't understand what was going on, and the military man assumed that the healer wasn't familiar with the place. The man confessed that they just clean the tent when everyone dies, because it is very difficult to clean the bodies with a huge number of flies. The protagonist started to move inside this tent. He was very worried because the camp was in a terrible state, and he did not know how to get extra lives in such conditions. The protagonist asked who was in charge of the camp, and the man confessed that it was Vikand. The protagonist immediately told the military man to bring him to their leader. Some time later in Vikand's chamber, the man himself was enjoying a fine taste of wine. He said with a delighted and calm look that the wine was excellent. Suddenly Vikand heard strange noises, and a moment later Damien's strong blow shattered the glass in the man's hands, who immediately started yelling at the man who dared to do such a thing. Vikand started yelling at the daredevils who dared to attack him, under the request of the protagonist to beat the man normally. The protagonist paralleled that Damien should make the man feel as if he hadn't been paid for 2 months. Damien instantly realized the seriousness of this request. He thought about the fact that he would have to somehow not kill the man. Damien continued to beat up the man, who couldn't do anything about it. Suddenly the man ordered the guys to stop because he was the head of the place. The protagonist said that he knew about the man's status, and said that he himself was a secret imperial inspector. The protagonist showed the document and said that it was his duty to catch scum like men. Sweat appeared on the man's neck, his eyes clearly showing the fear he was feeling at this very moment. The protagonist shouted that he was an honest doctor who had been sent to this place undercover. Then the man began to read the document that the prince held out. The man was shocked by what he saw in the document, namely that all power over the camp goes into the hands of the protagonist. The man did not understand what he had done and why he was being treated this way. The prince started yelling at the man, who didn't even realize how many people he had ruined with his actions. The prince just didn't understand how such a man could get to this place. The prince threw the man to the ground and then ordered Damien to take the man away from the place. A short while later, the prince stood in front of Damien. The protagonist asked if the man had been hysterical after being discharged, and Damien said that the man had only babbled about his military career being ruined. Damien suggested that he had hit the man too hard on the head, but the protagonist stated that he fully deserved what he got. The prince stated that the man had set up a morgue in this camp, not a hospital. Damien looked silently at the prince, while the protagonist did not understand why his subordinate was silent. Damien did not answer and asked what the protagonist would do now. The prince started to leave with the words that they had to meet the doctor. Sometime later, in one of the tents, the protagonist sat with Damien and the doctor. The protagonist was well aware that in roughly this era, there was simply no care for the wounded. The protagonist began to give out instructions to the doctor on how to improve the place, while the doctor listened intently. Suddenly a soldier entered the room and apologized for the sudden visit. He asked the doctor for help and the wounded soldier began to be led inside. The condition of the man was deplorable. His body was covered with wounds. There were 2 arrows in his shoulder. Even in the side of his body there was an arrow that pierced his body. The protagonist was well aware that the patient's condition was deplorable to say the least. The protagonist assumed that the fighter had been wounded at least a few days ago, because mold had already started to appear on the bandage. The prince thought that although the wound was not fatal, but the lack of care was critical. The protagonist realized that in such a state they would not be able to save anyone. The prince asked the doctor's opinion, and he said that the guy needed an urgent operation. The protagonist thought that inviting a doctor who specialized in surgery was a great idea. Looking at the tired soldier, he thought that he should do everything possible. The protagonist asked if the doctor could perform the surgery right now, and he said with a firm look that he would do it. The doctor started digging through his bag and pulled out a huge cleaver. The doctor stated that this cleaver was a scalpel, which was used to cut the body for amputation. The doctor showed a tool for cutting human bones, which frightened the prince. The doctor with a mad look stated that the faster it was done, the less agony the patient would experience. The protagonist asked the doctor about anesthesia, and he didn't even seem to know the word. The doctor said that they could give the patient rum and opium to make him unconscious, because it would be better than when he was conscious. The doctor confessed that he used vodka instead of rum, because it tasted better. The doctor said that he was going to amputate the arm first. The prince said that the doctor should put the instruments back because the amputation was not necessary. The protagonist said that they would perform the operation in a different way than the doctor suggested. The doctor didn't seem to understand that there were other operations. The protagonist examined the patient's body, thinking that his body was just on the edge. The protagonist was also well aware that if you cut a man in such a state, he would surely die. The prince thought about the fact that he needed anesthesia. The prince did not know where to get the right medicine. The organs instantly began to give advice to the protagonist, and also listed him 100 points, saying that he should improve his skills. The balance of the hero was 4,900. The prince instantly opened a list of all available skills, after which the protagonist saw a huge number of notifications with available skills. Suddenly the guy noticed a very unusual skill. It turns out there was a skill that contributed to relieve patients from pain. Everyone watched as the prince smiled very creepily over the body of the military man. The military seemed to be frightened by this reaction of the protagonist, who just came to his senses, then looked at his new skill with admiration. The protagonist thought that a simple stroking that caused anesthesia was just a cheater. The protagonist said that the doctor should get ready. The prince confessed that he had found a way to anesthetize the patient's body, and ordered him to prepare for surgery. The doctor instantly perked up, and was fully prepared. The prince asked the soldier's name, and he introduced himself as a junior private named Diop. The prince said he would start treatment from now on. The patient assumed that the hero would cut off his arm, but the protagonist tried to convince the man that he would not cut off his arm. The man with a crazy look said that he was an optimistic person and he was sure that he could live without his arm. The protagonist was getting angry at the words of the patient, who was barely holding back his tears, saying that he was an optimist. The prince yelled at the patient and ordered him to shut his mouth before he decided to amputate his head. The protagonist said he was beginning to administer anesthesia, whereupon the prince awkwardly began stroking the man's arm. Suddenly the protagonist began to sing, which amazed Damien, and the doctor did not expect such a thing from his master. The faces of the military at that moment are hard to convey in words. They definitely thought that the prince was a real madman. While the patient seemed to say goodbye to his life, the protagonist was happy that he was able to use the skill just because he was singing a song. Suddenly, the system said that the skill stopped working because the prince was not singing sincerely, which naturally made him angry. The prince thought about what he needed to sing correctly, and then began to sing that stupid song again. This time the main character put out 100% and looked incredible. To the shocked looks of the people around him, the main character's hand began to emit light. The man was amazed that his side stopped hurting, while the hero continued to sing. The man didn't understand how it was possible for his pain to just go away. The protagonist was about to check if the anesthesia was working well. The prince started to check the patient's pain, but the patient felt nothing at all. The protagonist said it was time for them to start the surgery, and to start by cleaning the wounds and stitching them up. The bloody instruments stood in place for a while. It turned out that they coped with the man's torso, and the prince suggested to start working on the arm. The man worried about whether it would be all right if they didn't cut off the damaged area. The man worried for his life, thinking he might die, while the protagonist began to sing his chants and his arm emitted light. The system notified the prince that his skill level had been increased. It appeared that the strength and range of the anesthesia had increased. The prince began to pinch the man's arm, but he didn't react at all, which meant that the strength of the anesthesia had increased. The protagonist said that they should proceed. The doctor instantly pulled out a thread and then cut it into pieces. The man immediately grabbed his knife and began to wield it like a true professional at breakneck speed. Looking at the bloody knife, the prince thought that the doctor had incredible skills. The protagonist thought that the doctor's skills were high even if you take a modern doctor. The protagonist thought that the doctor's stitching technique was incredible. The prince was now not surprised that the doctor had gotten such a position in the court at his age. The men watching the operation were shocked. They saw that the patient was in no pain at all. They assumed that the protagonist was some kind of miracle doctor. After a while there was silence in the room, which was interrupted by the prince asking if the soldier was all right. The protagonist confessed that from now on the real treatment would begin and the patient should not relax. The prince said that as soon as the supplies arrived, he would immediately prescribe a cure for the patient. The man didn't understand why they cared about him so much, because he was a wounded soldier who couldn't return to the battlefield and it was a waste of resources to spend on someone like him. The protagonist was surprised that the man really did not understand, because he is a doctor and he must save people, but the soldier was just as sick. On the cheeks of the man began to appear tears. With an incredibly bright smile on his face, the patient thanked the protagonist. While the prince himself thought about the fact that he said those words only to get a bonus. The prince assumed that his words had worked as they should, after which the protagonist ordered everyone to rest, and then confidently left the tent. All the organs started applauding the protagonist. At that time the system said that the words of the protagonist from this point onwards would be known to the people around him. Also the system said that from now on all the wounded people in the camp will honor the prince as a saint. The system also said that the prince had created a revolution in the treatment of patients at the front. Suddenly the protagonist was rewarded with 5,000 points, and he had 5,400 points on his balance. Exactly 2 days later, the protagonist was performing emergency operations to the military. Also the protagonist's skill had increased to level 3. The prince with a smile on his face continued to sing an incredibly strange song. The doctor looked at the patient's leg and was sure that it should be amputated. The protagonist asked the doctor to first clean the wound and then stitch it up. The doctor instantly began his work, and sometime later the prince called the doctor to talk to him. He said that the doctor should listen to him carefully, and then ordered that the place should be cleaned up while he was away. The protagonist confessed that he would go to a certain place for a while. A while later in the dense forest, Damien doubted that the protagonist knew the way as he said he had read about the place in a book. To Damien's interest, the prince replied that he just couldn't remember all the names of the books he had read. Damien looked with disbelief in the prince's direction, but didn't ask again. Damien thought about how the prince gets incredibly strange at some points. Damien was telling the protagonist that they had gone too far into the forest. He was talking about how they might accidentally wander into monster territory. The protagonist knew very well that they might encounter monsters. The prince said that the boys didn't need to be afraid of the monsters because they were scary. Everyone listened as the prince underestimated the scary monsters. The protagonist was surprised that the boys didn't know about the weakness of the monsters. They all thought that no one in their right mind would go to those monsters, and also thought that the prince was an adequate man, and they would definitely not go there. The protagonist said that they would not touch the monsters. Then, with the calmest look possible, said that they would kidnap the queen of the monsters. The prince was confident under the fear in the eyes of his allies. One of the organs was amazed at the words of the protagonist, and the other organs supported him in his indignation. One of the organs said that the prince really believed that it was possible to kidnap the monster queen. The organs could barely contain their laughter, and a few seconds later started laughing at the top of their voices. One of the organs realized that the prince was deliberately delaying to reveal his plan. The organs donated 100 points for criticizing the prince. The protagonist, on the other hand, proudly closed the system notification, thinking he didn't care. The protagonist was well aware that if he had said in advance what he wanted to do, they wouldn't have gone anywhere. The protagonist was also well aware of the soldiers' reactions, but he knew they needed to get the maggot. The protagonist thought about the fact that the substance the maggot excreted had incredible antibiotic properties that could help save an incredible number of soldiers. The prince began to move towards his men, then asked what was wrong with their faces. Damien said that even a small Opyros was a ferocious monster. Damien asked if the prince had any idea what would happen if they touched the nest or the womb, and the prince seemed to understand exactly what would happen. Damien asked if the prince realized what it would cost to kidnap a larva. The prince understood that just as well. Damien was angry that his lord had suggested such heresy. Damien said that he knew the prince liked to do reckless things, as he had often encountered such things, and then he got angry and said that this time the prince had definitely crossed the line. The protagonist made a silly look while the guy continued to get angry. They started talking about how the person who would grab the maggot would be in great danger. Damien also suggested that the prince was just crazy. Damien was getting ready to grab his sword. Then the main character stated that Damien would get the maggot, which made him very angry. The prince started talking about how he knew a great way to pull this off safely. The protagonist got his pet. Then the prince said he was going to tell him the plan. The prince said that first Damien would have to get close to the nest. Then the prince wanted Damien to hit the nest, which would make the monsters rage. Then the protagonist was going to use a huge hedgehog form. The prince said that Damien would only need to hide behind the pet, after which he could safely leave the nest site. The protagonist said that while Damien was going through with the plan, he would capture the mate that would remain in the nest. Damien said that even if the plan worked, the monsters were too persistent and would definitely not let him go along with the hero's pet. The protagonist said that the monsters would retreat if there was a fire in their nest. The prince assumed that the allies were now clear and offered to depart. Damien was angry, wondering what kind of man the prince was. Damien started to think about the hero's plan. He started to say that he was too dangerous. The prince immediately realized everything and said that he would pay Damien a bonus, after which a smile appeared on his face, because he got what he wanted. People thought that the prince would not act rashly. One of the soldiers thought that the doctor had once performed a miracle and assumed that even if they were hurt, the hero would be able to cure them. He thought that was the reason they were going to this place. A while later, Damien moved in front of the group through the tall grass. He spread the tall grass with his hands. Then a moment later he froze in place, because right in front of him was an incredibly huge nest of monsters. There were also monster bees flying above his head. Damien began to scratch the back of his head. He thought about the fact that he doubted that a single prize would be enough for such an operation. The prince was amazed at what he saw. He thought the nest would be many times smaller than what was right in front of him. The protagonist thought about the fact that if they hadn't soaked their bodies in colors, they would have been discovered long ago. The prince thought it was worth watching the monsters, also hoping Damien along with his pet. Suddenly there was an incredibly eerie sound. The prince was amazed at what was happening right in front of his eyes. A huge moat of monsters started moving towards them at a great speed. Damien didn't understand how such a thing could happen. The prince thought that Damien was too poorly camouflaged and he didn't know what to do, until the prince threw a rock right at the guy, saying that the only thing left to do was to attack the nest. Damien slowly started to rise to his feet. Then he thought about how he was going to use the skills he had been practicing so hard earlier. The protagonist thought that Damien was making a mistake, and if even a little something went wrong, there would be trouble. The prince started to move towards Damien. He tried to stop the guy, who right at that moment looked a little crazy. Fire was burning in his eyes. Then he prepared his sword to make an incredibly strong attack. The prince kept trying to stop Damien, who froze for a moment while an incredible number of monsters started flying over their heads. The protagonist didn't realize what these monsters were that were bigger than Epiros. One of the monsters pierced the bee's body, after which the other monsters did the same. The protagonist just did not understand why the monsters were fighting among themselves, as suddenly a shadow appeared on the face of the prince, which was thrown by the monster, which at the same moment at a great speed flew towards the guys. The monster looked incredibly creepy, and was preparing to finish off the guys. The monster attacked with great force, but it turned out that Damien was able to save the prince at the last moment. The protagonist was well aware that this was no ordinary slaughterhouse. The monster pulled its huge stinger from another monster. A massive battle started between these monsters. One of the humans said that they were monsters called Vesperos. The prince asked what these monsters were. It turned out that they were monsters for which Epiros were food, and they could kill hundreds of individuals. The protagonist ordered all the people to rise to their feet. They did not understand what was happening, and the prince said that they were caught. It turned out that all the guys were noticed by a huge crowd of creepy monsters, which immediately went to attack the fleeing guys. The guys were running away at a great speed from the terrible monster. The prince asked if they would eventually be able to escape from these monsters. The protagonist confessed that he came to this place to get a uterus, because thanks to it you can save a huge number of soldiers. The prince was amazed that Damien could assume that he was doing something like this just for his whim. The boys continued to run away from the scary monsters. Damien thought that he needed to buy time for them. Then he prepared to attack with his sword, and in one move he chopped a huge number of trees. Damien continued to back away from the monsters, while the main character seemed to notice something right in front of them. He instantly pointed his finger at a rock and ordered everyone to hide behind it. The guys started climbing over the rock, trying to get away from the monsters. Eventually they found themselves behind the rock. One of the soldiers confessed that she had not had time to tell them about one of the problems. The man said that these monsters are very careful to clean up after themselves. It turns out that they stack the corpses in one pile and kill all the living, even those who try to hide. The prince understood that they had to leave. But he didn't want to lose the mate. He thought that no one could survive in this nest. Not even the mate. The protagonist realized that saving the queen was a waste of time, and suddenly the earth began to shake. It turned out that very near were these terrible monsters. The guys closed their mouths in the hope of hiding their breath. The monsters seemed to notice something. Thanks to their abilities, they saw the guys right behind the rock. A moment later, one of the monsters got ready to attack. Then it split the stone in two, and the guys retreated a bit. Damien asked if the prince was all right, then grabbed the protagonist by the scruff of the neck and threw the prince at a great speed straight into the sky. Damien, along with the other soldiers, began to repel the attacks of these monsters, while the protagonist landed on one of the trees at a tremendous speed. The prince was thinking about the fact that Damien used to serve him tea, but now he was just throwing him God knows where. The prince was incredibly angry and was about to lose the guy a month's paycheck. Suddenly the prince noticed that he was sitting on something. It turned out that the guy used to live in this forest, and that's why he was running so fast. He also pointed in the direction of the battle with the monsters. Damien fought the enemies with all his might. He prepared to attack. While the enemy was about to launch an attack, their blows collided with each other and caused a shockwave. The battle continued at an incredible pace. The prince didn't understand how the monsters could find them so easily, and the guy said that it was probably because of the smell of the flowers. The protagonist realized that they were all too open to these monsters now. The protagonist realized that his men needed to use their full power, and that would only stop a dozen enemies. The prince began to think hard, and then an incredible idea appeared in his head. The prince asked for the guy's Orzac, after which he took out a bottle with unclear contents. The protagonist confessed that it was an incredibly strong alcohol, which he was going to use as a disinfectant. The protagonist prepared to throw the bottle, saying that since the enemies were wasps, they should like it. He threw the bottle directly at the enemies and the bottle shattered against a tree, knowing full well that wasps go crazy for alcohol. Suddenly the wasps stopped attacking the humans. Damien didn't understand what happened and what exactly made the monsters stop their attacks. While the monsters were attacking the tree with the alcohol on it, the protagonist was happy that his trick had worked. All the soldiers were saying that they should run away as soon as possible, and the prince was saying that if they tried to run away, they would all die. The protagonist confessed that his words were completely true. The prince said that alcohol was only a temporary solution to the problem. The prince said that they just couldn't escape the monsters in the time they had. The protagonist said that they just needed to set the enemies on fire. One of the humans started to worry that the elves might punish them. Damien, on the other hand, thought the prince was definitely up to something. The guys lit the prepared torches, and then the main character ordered to attack with them, and a moment later the whole forest was filled with fire. The forest began to burn very rapidly. The monsters stayed at the tree on which there was alcohol, as suddenly they came to their senses and looked in the direction where the prince's team was. The bees began to fly away from that place, but right in front of them they saw the corpses of their brethren, which were burning to ashes. The monsters just flew through the forest and burned, while the prince ordered everyone to run as fast as they could, because if they didn't make it in time, they would be burned. The forest was completely covered in flames while the protagonist and his men fled. Although the prince was able to destroy the monsters, he felt that his respiratory system had come to an end. Suddenly, the protagonist ran into a rock with his foot, after which he fell to the ground, which was noticed by one of the fleeing allies. He immediately began to help the protagonist. The organs felt the incredible danger and gave the protagonist 500 points. Damien said that if the prince lost consciousness in this place, he would definitely die, so the prince should not have lost consciousness. Damien started talking about carrying the prince. Then he put the prince on his back, then secured the protagonist with a cloth, and eventually the embarrassed prince was sitting on Damien's back. People were wondering if it was okay to treat the crown prince like that, but the prince said that they should get out of the forest as soon as possible, and then they would be safe. Suddenly something incredibly huge landed right in front of the guys. It was just a huge monster that started screaming with all its might, making incredibly loud noises. One of the people started screaming that they were all dead, because it was the Queen of Vesperos. The protagonist didn't understand why Damien was so scared. The prince had never seen a guy in such a state, and he was the strongest of them all. The protagonist realized that if Damien surrendered, they were all dead. The protagonist was going to release the tension from Damien's body. Then the prince started to move on Damien's body. Suddenly the system headed towards the target, namely the queen of these monsters. The protagonist thought that this could be their chance. It turns out he saw everything thanks to his ability. A fire appeared in the prince's eyes. He saw everything inside the monster. Then a smile appeared on the prince's face. The protagonist confessed that he had an amazing idea. The prince said that from now on Damien would have to follow all his commands. The prince confessed that he was able to predict the movement of the monster. Damien did not understand how this was possible, but instead of answering, the prince ordered everyone to head down. Then all safely dodged the attack of a huge monster, which could not hurt the guys and just flew over them. The prince ordered to take 5 steps forward, after which the team did so, and they again managed to dodge the attack of the monster. The protagonist, on the other hand, froze in place for a moment, while the monster started to look even crazier. It flew into the air with an incredibly huge force. The protagonist ordered the other soldiers to stand back while he and Damien fought the monster. Then Damien prepared to jump, and thanks to the instructions of the protagonist, the guy was able to once again dodge the monster's attack. The prince continued to give commands. He gave himself completely to this process. The prince gave incredibly clear instructions, as suddenly there was an incredibly powerful explosion. The monster began to rise from his seat. People watching the scene thought that they did not even need to intervene, because the prince was doing a great job, while the other man seemed very worried about the outcome of this battle. The monster began to look much scarier. It made terrible sounds. The protagonist immediately gave a command, and they retreated some distance, then began to roll on the ground. The prince ordered Damien to concentrate. Then, thanks to the words of the protagonist, Damien successfully fought against the monster that surpassed him many times over. The guys jumped up from their seats, thanks to which they managed to avoid the monster's incredibly strong attack, after which they landed on the monster's back and began to strike. The prince ordered Damien to attack the monster's wings, after which the guy jumped up from his seat. The prince ordered him to retreat and land on a tree. Damien did so and jumped off the monster's body with great force. Damien said that even though the prince could see all the movements of the enemy, they would not be able to win at this rate, while the hero said that his plan would work. The prince ordered the guy to get ready, and then the monster went into a furious attack, and the protagonist counted down to the right movement, and at the right moment Damien jumped up from his seat, avoiding the enemy's attack. The protagonist said that they had 3 seconds to spare, and then Damien let go of the tree branch on the prince's order, and they attacked the monster with the sword directly from the air. The force of the blow was unbelievably strong, and the people watching the battle opened their mouths in surprise. Damien asked if it was over, but the enemy was still alive. The protagonist began to give orders to move forward, while the enemy stared at the guys. Then he attacked the ground, which caused cracks to appear on it. Damien asked when they should dodge, and the prince told him to wait a little longer. The prince grabbed Damien's stripes, creating 2 ponytails, and angered the monster, which headed into a furious attack on the guys. The prince told Damien to do as he said. Then Damien threw his blade straight towards the monster, and the blade pierced through the monster's incredibly strong body, causing the monster to scream in pain. Suddenly the monster started to shake. Then its eyes started to close, and eventually it fell to the ground. The prince was happy that they managed to win this battle. Thank you all so much for watching this video. If you liked it, please like it and write your opinion in the comments. And I will say goodbye to you. See you soon.